John Miller's life had been quiet ever since his wife Emma passed away 5 years ago. He spent his days working on small tasks around his humble house in the small town of Oakfield, Missouri. The house sat at the end of a quiet gravel road, surrounded by open fields and the occasional oak tree. It was a simple life, one that left him with plenty of time to think and for loneliness to quietly settle in. The day everything changed began like any other. John was sitting at the local diner, a place where he and Emma used to share pancakes on Saturday mornings. As he sipped his coffee, lost in thought, a headline from a day-old newspaper caught his attention. Local tragedy claims young parents, 2 children left behind. He read the article twice. Caleb, 10, and Mason, 7, had lost their parents in a car accident just outside of town. No relatives had come forward to claim them, and they were now in the foster care system. John set the paper down and stared out the diner window, a heavy ache settling in his chest. It wasn't the kind of pain that passed quickly. He thought of Emma's words, often said when they dreamed of having children. If we can't have our own, maybe we're meant to help someone who needs us. Her voice seemed to echo in the room, even though she was long gone. 2 weeks later, John sat in his lawyer's office, adoption papers spread across the desk. It was a decision he never thought he'd make, but once the idea had taken hold, there was no turning back. He wasn't just adopting 2 boys. He was opening his home and his heart to a future he couldn't fully understand. As he signed his name, the lawyer, an older man with graying hair, raised an eyebrow and asked, "You know, people around here are going to talk. Are you sure about this?" John's hand paused for a moment, then continued signing. "Let them talk," he replied firmly. By the time he left the office with the paperwork completed, John felt a mix of fear and determination. For the first time in years, he wasn't just going through the motions of life. He had a purpose. The first meeting with Caleb and Mason took place at the children's home, a brick building on the edge of Oakfield. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and cafeteria food, and the quiet hum of children's voices echoed through the hallways. John sat in a plastic chair, his hands resting on his knees as he waited. When the boys finally walked in, John stood. Caleb, the older brother, entered first. His dark, cautious eyes scanned the room before meeting John's gaze. At 10 years old, Caleb already seemed burdened by a weight too heavy for his small frame, as if the world rested on his shoulders. Behind him, Mason clung to his brother's shirt, his steps hesitant. At just 7, he appeared small and fragile, but there was a spark of curiosity in his eyes that John couldn't ignore. "Hi, boys," John said, his voice calm despite the nervous energy pulsing in his chest. "I'm John Miller." Caleb didn't respond right away. He studied John as if trying to determine whether this man was just another in a long line of temporary adults. Meanwhile, Mason whispered something to his brother, who gave a subtle nod before stepping forward. "Are you really going to take both of us?" Caleb asked, his voice soft but steady. John knelt to meet Caleb's eye level. "That's the only way this works," he said firmly. "You and Mason come as a package deal." Mason peeked out from behind Caleb, his lips trembling. "For how long?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "For good," John answered, his words carrying weight, sinking deep into the room. "This isn't just for now. I'm here for the long haul. You boys are going to have a home with me." The words hung in the air, heavy with promise. For a moment, the boys seemed unsure whether to believe him. But then, something shifted. Mason let go of Caleb's shirt and stepped forward, his small hand reaching out. John didn't hesitate. He took the boy's hand in his own, feeling the fragility and trust in that simple gesture. The ride home was quiet, the only sound being the crunch of gravel under the truck's tires. Caleb and Mason sat close together in the back seat, their small backpacks tightly clutched in their hands. John glanced at them in the rearview mirror, his chest tightening with a mix of protectiveness and uncertainty. As they pulled into the driveway, Mason spoke for the first time since leaving the children's home. "It's big," he said softly. John looked at the house. "It's home," he replied simply. He led the boys inside, showing them their shared bedroom. It was small but cozy, with matching twin beds and a window overlooking the backyard. Caleb carefully set his backpack down, his eyes scanning the room, while Mason immediately sat on one of the beds, bouncing lightly on the mattress. John cleared his throat. "Listen," he began, his voice low and steady. "I know this is all new and it might be a little scary, but I want you to know something important. This isn't temporary. This is your home now, and I'll be here for you, no matter what." Caleb's jaw tightened, and for a moment John thought the boy might push back. But then Caleb gave a small nod. Meanwhile, Mason whispered, "Promise?" "I promise," John replied, his voice firm. In that moment, he knew he had made the right decision. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The first few weeks tested John in ways he hadn't expected. Caleb and Mason had endured more in their short lives than most adults could imagine, and it showed. Caleb kept his emotions tightly locked away, rarely speaking unless asked a direct question. Mason, on the other hand, was full of nervous energy, prone to sudden tears or bursts of laughter, almost as if it was a defense mechanism rather than genuine joy. Then there was the town. Oakfield wasn't a place where secrets stayed hidden for long. Whispers began almost immediately. At the grocery store, a neighbor glanced at John's shopping cart filled with snacks and kids' cereals, her expression a mix of surprise and judgment. At church, the congregation buzzed when John walked in with the boys, their young faces standing out in the sea of familiar ones. It wasn't long before the whispers turned into more overt acts. The hardware store suddenly didn't have the paint John needed for the boys' room. A local diner mysteriously reserved every booth when John and the boys stopped in for breakfast. He even heard murmurs at town council meetings, where people spoke in coded language about unconventional families and preserving the community. One afternoon, Caleb and Mason were playing basketball in the driveway when an older couple walked past. The man muttered something to his wife, loud enough for Caleb to hear. "He'll regret it," the man muttered. John, who had been cleaning tools in the garage, stepped outside just as Caleb froze mid-dribble. The boy's face was carefully blank, but John could see the tension in his shoulders. He walked over and placed a firm hand on Caleb's shoulder. "Don't listen to them," John said, his voice steady. "Some people talk because they don't know how to think. You're here because you belong here. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." Caleb nodded, but John could tell the boy was struggling to believe it. Nighttime was the hardest. Mason had nightmares, vivid, terrifying ones, that sent him running into John's room in tears. The first time it happened, John sat with him on the edge of the bed, his arm wrapped protectively around the boy's trembling frame. "Was it about the accident?" John asked gently. Mason nodded, burying his face in John's chest. "I miss them," he whispered. "I know you do," John said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's okay to miss them. It's okay to feel sad. But I'm here now, Mason. You're not alone." Mason clung tighter to him, and for the first time John felt like he was beginning to break through the walls the boys had built around their hearts. Caleb, however, was a different story. The boy carried himself with a quiet toughness that made it hard for John to know what he was feeling. One evening, as John worked on fixing a broken step on the porch, Caleb approached him, holding a small wooden box. "What's this?" John asked, wiping his hands on his jeans. Caleb hesitated before handing over the box. Inside were photographs, family pictures, and candid snapshots of his parents. "I don't want Mason to see these yet," Caleb said quietly. "He's not ready." John nodded, carefully closing the box. "You're a good big brother," he said. "You take care of him." Caleb shrugged, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Pride, maybe. It's just what I do. Despite the struggles, there were small victories. Mason started laughing more, real laughter, the kind that filled the house with warmth. Caleb, ever serious, showed interest in John's carpentry projects, watching intently as John explained how to sand and stain wood. The boys were healing slowly but surely, and though John knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. Spring arrived early that year, bringing warmer days and clearer skies. John saw it as an opportunity to get the boys involved in the community. Despite the lingering skepticism around town, he signed them up for youth sports, Caleb for basketball and Mason for soccer, and decided they would all pitch in for the upcoming town cleanup day. The first game day didn't go as smoothly as John had hoped. Caleb, wearing his freshly issued basketball jersey, walked onto the court with his team, only to be met with stares from the parents on the sidelines. John noticed some of them whispering, their gazes darting between Caleb and him. The game started, and Caleb's talent quickly became evident. He was fast, precise, and completely focused. By halftime, even the most skeptical parents had to admit the boy was good. Still, the air was thick with tension after the game. As Caleb walked off the court, John saw one of the other parents approach him. The man, wearing a baseball cap and a skeptical expression, extended his hand. "He's got real talent," he said gruffly. "You must be proud." John shook his hand firmly. "I am. He's worked hard." It wasn't a complete thought, but it was a start. At the town cleanup day, things took another step forward. Volunteers gathered in the town square, armed with brooms, garbage bags, and gloves. John and the boys joined a group assigned to repaint the gazebo. As they worked, Mason's chatter filled the air, drawing smiles from a few older volunteers. "Mr. Miller," one woman said, wiping her hands on her apron as she took a break. "Mason's got a way of making work feel a little lighter. He's a bright kid." "He is," John replied, watching Mason laugh as he tried to paint a straight line on the gazebo railing. Caleb, more reserved, worked diligently beside him, his strokes even and precise. As the day went on, more people began to engage with the boys. Caleb demonstrated his knack for carpentry when he fixed a wobbly bench. Earning a nod of approval from one of the older men, Caleb's quiet confidence was evident. Meanwhile, Mason managed to organize a small group of kids to help clean up trash around the park. By the end of the day, the atmosphere had shifted. People were no longer just tolerating John and the boys. They were starting to see them as part of the community. The real turning point came when Mason entered the town's annual Spring Festival art contest. He spent days working on a painting of his late parents, a heartfelt tribute that captured their love and warmth. When he submitted it, John wasn't sure how it would be received. On the day of the festival, Mason's painting was displayed alongside others in the town square. People stopped to admire it, their expressions softening as they took in the emotion behind the brushstrokes. When the winners were announced, Mason's name echoed through the square. The applause that followed was genuine, and as Mason walked up to receive his ribbon, John saw something shift in the crowd. The boys' joy was infectious, and for the first time, the whispers of judgment seemed to fade. That evening, as they walked home, Caleb spoke up. "It feels different," he said quietly. "What does?" John asked. "People," Caleb replied, glancing back at the square where the festival lights still twinkled. "They're not looking at us the same way." John smiled. "That's because they're starting to see what I see, two amazing kids who belong here." It started as a distant rumble late one afternoon, the kind of storm the local news had been warning about for days. By evening, the sky turned a bruised gray, and the winds picked up, bending the trees in John's backyard. Caleb and Mason stood by the living room window, their faces lit with a mix of fascination and fear. "Will it be bad?" Mason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. John put a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Storms can be tough, but this house has stood through worse. We'll be okay. The power flickered, then went out completely. John grabbed a flashlight and herded the boys to the basement. The sound of rain pounding against the roof was deafening, accompanied by the occasional snap of branches breaking in the wind. Caleb sat close to Mason, his arm wrapped protectively around his younger brother. When the storm finally passed, John led the boys upstairs. They stepped outside to survey the damage. Shingles were scattered across the yard, branches strewn everywhere, and a portion of the fence leaned precariously. Across the street, a neighbor's roof had partially caved in. The sound of sirens filled the air as emergency vehicles navigated the flooded streets. John took a deep breath and turned to the boys. "Let's get to work," he said. "There are people out there who need help." The next few days were a blur of activity. John and the boys spent every waking hour assisting neighbors with repairs. They cleared fallen branches, hammered plywood over broken windows, and distributed supplies from the community center. Mason quickly became a favorite among the neighbors, his cheerful demeanor providing a sense of normalcy amid the chaos. At one point, he handed a bottle of water to an elderly woman, who patted his cheek and said, "You've got a good heart, young man." Caleb, meanwhile, worked quietly but tirelessly, his focus unshakable. He spent hours helping John patch up roofs and secure unstable structures. One neighbor, a gruff man who had barely acknowledged John before, stopped by to thank them. "You're raising good boys," he said simply. "I'm just helping them be who they already are," John replied. The storm had brought the town together in unexpected ways. People who had once kept their distance now worked side by side with John and the boys. At the community potluck organized to thank the volunteers, Mason and Caleb sat among their peers, laughing and sharing stories as if they had lived in Springfield their entire lives. When the mayor stood to give a speech, he singled out John and the boys. "In times like these, we see the true character of people," he said. "John Miller and his sons have shown us what it means to care for others, no matter the circumstances." The applause that followed was thunderous, and for the first time, John felt like the town had truly accepted his family. That night, as they sat around the dining table eating leftover potluck dishes, Mason looked up at John. "Do you think Mom and Dad would have been proud of us?" he asked softly. John set his fork down, his throat tightening. "I know they would have been," he said, his voice firm. "And I'm proud of you too." Caleb glanced at Mason, then at John. "We're proud of you too," he said. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made John's heart swell. The weeks following the storm marked a turning point for John, Caleb, and Mason. The once closed doors of Springfield began to open, albeit slowly. People who had previously avoided them now waved as they passed, and the murmurs of disapproval gave way to conversations. The family's efforts during the storm had left a mark on the town. One Saturday, while Caleb and Mason played basketball in the driveway, a car pulled up. It was Mr. Peterson, one of the town's more vocal critics. He stepped out holding a small toolbox. "I heard you're fixing that old gazebo down at the park," he said, his tone awkward. "Thought you might need an extra pair of hands." John hesitated for a moment, then extended his own hand. "We could use the help," he said. That afternoon, Caleb worked alongside Mr. Peterson, sanding the gazebo rails, while Mason helped apply a fresh coat of paint. By the end of the day, the once dilapidated structure gleamed, and Mr. Peterson stayed long enough to share lemonade with the family on their porch. It wasn't an apology, but it was a step toward reconciliation. The town's transformation extended beyond individuals. Caleb's basketball team had a fundraiser to help families still recovering from the storm, and Mason suggested they donate part of the proceeds to repair the community center's playground. When Mason presented the idea to the group, a few kids hesitated. "What if we don't raise enough?" one boy asked. Mason grinned. "Then we'll keep going until we do." The fundraiser was a success, and the sight of Mason handing over a check to the community center director was enough to soften even the hardest hearts. Not everyone was quick to change. At a town council meeting, Mrs. Aldridge, an older woman known for her sharp tongue, stood to voice her concerns. "I still think this is all too much, too fast," she said, her words pointed but lacking the edge they once carried. Before John could respond, Caleb raised his hand. The room fell silent as the boy stood. "People can change," Caleb said, his voice steady. "If we can, so can you." The simple statement hung in the air, and Mrs. Aldridge sank back into her seat, her face thoughtful. The true moment of transformation came at the town's 4th of July celebration. The annual fireworks display was a big event, drawing families from all over Springfield. John, Caleb, and Mason arrived early to help set up chairs and tables. As the sun set, the park filled with people, and the air buzzed with excitement. When the fireworks began, Mason sat on John's lap, his face illuminated by the bursts of light in the sky. Caleb sat beside them, his expression a mix of awe and contentment. As the final firework exploded in a shower of gold and silver, John looked around at the crowd. For the first time, he felt like they weren't just tolerated, they were part of the town. Mason leaned his head against John's chest. "We belong here, don't we?" John smiled, his eyes misting. "Yeah, buddy, we do." The years passed, and Springfield looked different in many ways. New businesses had sprung up. The once crumbling playground was now a bustling hub of activity, and the gazebo Caleb and Mason had helped restore still stood as a symbol of resilience. But it wasn't just the town's physical changes that mattered, it was the people. John Parker's house had become a gathering place over the years, where neighbors felt welcome and kids came to shoot hoops in the driveway. His sons, now grown men, had carved out meaningful lives for themselves while still carrying the lessons learned in that little house at the end of the gravel road. Caleb, now 20, was studying architecture at the University of Kansas. He often returned home on weekends to help with community projects, his designs bringing new ideas to life. His latest project was a town mural, featuring images of the storm and the recovery that followed, honoring the unity that had grown in its aftermath. Mason, 17, had taken a different path. With his natural charisma and ability to connect with people, he led youth outreach programs at the local community center. He worked tirelessly to ensure that kids from all backgrounds had opportunities to thrive, offering mentorship and organizing events that bridged divides. On a warm summer evening, the town gathered for a dedication ceremony at the community center. A plaque was unveiled reading, "In honor of the Parker family, for teaching us what it means to be a community." John stood at the back of the crowd, his arms crossed as he watched his son speak. Caleb talked about the importance of building spaces that brought people together, while Mason shared stories about the kids he'd worked with and the difference a little kindness could make. When the speeches were over, Caleb found John near the food tables. "We couldn't have done any of this without you," he said. John shook his head, his voice low. "No, son, you both made your own paths. I just gave you the tools." As the crowd dispersed, Mason walked over carrying 2 plates of pie. "I saved the last pieces for us," he said with a grin. John chuckled, taking a plate. "Good to know some things don't change." The 3 of them sat on a bench near the playground, eating in comfortable silence. The sky darkened, and the first stars appeared, twinkling faintly above. "I think Mom would have been proud," Caleb said suddenly, his voice soft. John looked at his sons, his chest swelling with pride. "She would have been, and so am I." For a moment, none of them spoke. The distant sounds of laughter and conversation filled the air, a reminder of how far they'd all come. Caleb and Mason had grown into men of character and compassion, leaving behind a legacy of their own. As the night deepened, John realized that the house he'd built wasn't just a home for two boys. It was a foundation for a better future, one that would ripple far beyond Springfield.